Please join me in welcoming Túbọ sún.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm introduction and for the cheesecake. I am very happy to be here. It's my first time here. Well, yesterday was. And I'm very excited for the opportunity to speak about the work I've done and the challenges we face in the space of African language in technology. I wrote this talk as kind of a dedication to two of my professors that got me involved in language work. One of them was Professor Ronald Schaefer of Southern Illinois University. He's retired now. And Professor Francis Egbuhari of the University of Ibadan. So Professor Egbuhari, Professor Schaefer is, that's him. He was born in 1949. I first met him in Nigeria in 2002 when he came with a couple of friends and colleagues from the Southern Illinois University to work on a project, on a cross-university project with the University of Ibadan. He had worked with another professor of mine who was then the head of the Department of Linguistics, Professor Francis Egbuhari, that's him. And together they had done a lot of work on a language called Emai. Emai is spoken in southern Nigeria, Edo State. Emai is Egbuhari's first language. I met Schaefer much later after the 2002 meeting in the US when I was applying for a Fulbright program, and he was the director of international programs at SIUE and found my name and remembered me. And then he invited me to SIUE to work as a Fulbright FLTA where I was teaching Yorùbá, and that was me and him and his wife. I was very young, I know. And at the time, I had no idea what I was going to do with my language and linguistics degree. I had a first degree in linguistics. It was during the Fulbright program, being out of Nigeria, the opportunities I saw in the language in the field was one of the things that interested me in furthering my work in linguistics. So I came back for a master's program at SIUE. He was my project supervisor. In 2012, I wrote my master's thesis, a 300-page work titled Studies of Initial Tonal Acquisition by American Speakers, English speakers learning Yoruba. I wanted to find out what kind of mistakes American students would make if they were learning a tone language like Yoruba. And I had a team, I had 40 subjects, some who had no experience with any second language, some who had learned some second language that was non-tonal, like French, German, Spanish, some who had only experience with a tonal language that was not English, like Mandarin, and then people who had learned some Yoruba in SIUE. And I give them a test and try to find out what kind of mistakes they made, who learned, who did better, and all of that. 2 weeks ago, I sat with him for a Zoom meeting because I had started realizing many of my teachers were either retiring or were old, or some were dying. I wanted to speak with many of them and find out what got them into linguistics, what was the interesting thing, what made them who they were, what made them interested in learning languages. He was born in 1949, like I said earlier. He's a descendant of German immigrants. His great-grandfather, great-grandfather, I can't remember now, had arrived in the US from Prussia. He was given a farmland in Minnesota like they did in those days for people over 21 through the Homestead Act. At home, he said, they spoke German as a first language. He said on the farm, everybody spoke German, the neighbors spoke German, everybody spoke German, and that was their reality. And when they went out into the world, it was when they encountered English in school, etc. So I found that quite interesting because it was around the time when we had heard that English language was now the official language of the USA. And I was quite interested in hearing from him, who's an American, what that meant, and how does he see that compared to as a linguist. But then I found out that his own background even made it more interesting to hear what he had to say. It was also interesting to me because as someone who comes from Nigeria, where English language as an official language, as a tool of colonialism, had such a detrimental effect on how Nigerian languages had developed or not in different ways. So his story was kind of interesting. I look back at my own, at the growth of Nigerian languages and how we were told not to speak any of Nigerian languages in school. Sometimes we're punished. It's called it vernacular if you spoke your own language in school. I went to Wales a couple of years ago and found that it was the same there as well, where they had the Welsh knot. There was a board they hung on your neck in school if you spoke Welsh during the school hours. And whoever had the board on the neck at the end of the day had to be punished. Nigeria has over 500 languages. This is wrong as well again. This is a Nigerian map. There's so many languages there. Yoruba, which I speak, is here. Ìgbà is in southeast. There's several other smaller languages in between. Some are bigger than others. Hausa is here. Hausa spreads all over West Africa. It goes out of Nigeria to Benin and goes on to Niger, etc. Yoruba also extended a little bit into Benin Republic, and then through the Middle Passage, it also came to the New World, through Cuba and Brazil, etc. So English language was imposed as a tool of governance and of the courts, of exams, of education, mostly of instruction and general communication. So native languages, over time, deteriorated into little spaces where nobody would use them publicly because they were either afraid of, the repercussion in school, or sometimes ethnic tensions between other bigger cultures around you, or just being able to communicate with other people. English language became that language. And that role of English, while positive in some way in helping people understand each other, or also then became such a burden where many languages started falling out of use over the years. Some languages have been luckier than others. Like I said, Hausa is one of the strongest spoken languages in Nigeria because many people use them as first languages. Yoruba has also been luckier than most because before, even during colonial times, many people still use the language, used it in newspapers, used it for education, used it in many other ways. This is a Yoruba newspaper in 1922, so there were people who used it in those days for communication. Yoruba is spoken by about 50 million speakers. Hausa is spoken by about 70 million or so, Igbo about 50 million. Those are the three major languages in Nigeria, but like I said, there are several more. But over the years, colonization, I mentioned earlier, then globalization, technological age, and then the AI, there have been new developments that left African languages behind. Let me give you a few specifics. So Yoruba is a tone language, for instance. Examples of Yoruba tone: Owo, hand; Owo, respect; Owo, broom. For people who don't speak Yoruba, I probably have said the same thing 3 times. Those who do, they can tell the difference. This was what I was investigating in my thesis. Owo, money; Owo, industry; Owo, border. The difference between the ones up here and the ones down here are the vowel quality signs on the there, which tells you the difference between O and O, and then the tone on top, which tells you the difference between mid-tone, high tone, low tone, mid-tone, low tone, etc. If you don't write the word properly, you would say something different depending on context. If you know the context of the expression, you might already understand what the person is writing or trying to write. If you don't, you might get confused. The farm is spelled the same way as the penis. See what I mean? Ile, ile, oko, exact, etc. So Yoruba language created a problem for many people who tried to write in it, in that if you don't, if the context is not clear, you might be saying something you don't intend to say. And so this has affected a number of, over the years, affected the use of Yoruba in public, but also in publishing, which is critically where the problem starts. So let's go back to that newspaper I showed you earlier, Eko Akete. Usually if you are writing this properly, Eko would have marks on top, Akete will have one as well. They try to at least put the subdots also set, but nothing on the top. Because many of the print devices they had then could barely even do what they had there. See how far the O is from the diacritic that it should usually be touching. This is an example of Grammarly today, which would underline things he finds grammatically or stylistically problematic. But at the time I was doing my undergrad project in 2005, the things that would be underlined would be names, Yoruba names, or anything that's not in English. So Francis Egbuhari would have been the one that would be underlined. And so when I was doing my undergrad project, I decided that there was a problem in technology in a way it affected African languages. And again, this comes from, like I said, the technological problems of the past, but internet then came and many of the problems that already existed just joined and became even more severe. And so I decided to create a dictionary of Yoruba names as a final year project supervised by my professor Buhari. And one of the things I wanted to do then that I thought would be important would be creating a dictionary where, I mean, at least the long-term goal would be to make sure that there is a record of Nigerian names, or Yoruba names I was starting with, such that if any computer system or product or software was made in the future, it already understands when you're using the Nigerian environment, this is a Nigerian name, I don't need to underline it. And so that was what I did. The project was 1,000 names in a CD. I pronounced, did the pronunciation, found the meanings, and submitted as an undergraduate project. This was 2005. Of course, I couldn't effect any of these things I had in mind, but I just thought that it was a direction of the future. If the data was there, maybe one day somebody would be able to do something interesting. Eventually, 10 years later, I turned it into a website where you can see now called yorubaname.com. Last week or so, we got to a 10,000th entry. It was the same project I started as an undergrad. It was just online now, accessible anywhere in the world, for any Yoruba person to add their name, to improve the meaning of the names that exist, to find the morphological breakdown of names. So you could, if you go to the dictionary, any name you click, you could find you could break it down into different morphemes and see the roots and how each name forms from the component parts. It also has an audio element where you click on the name, you can hear the pronunciation. To do that, I had to break Yoruba down into, Yoruba is a language that works with tone, but also each tone level is at the syllable level. So Kola, for instance, has 2 syllables. The name also has 2 tones. If your name is Abosede, 4 syllables, there are 4 tones on your name. So I sat down and then, the number of phonological processes that happen within Yoruba tonal system. When a high tone comes before a mid tone, the high tone is lower. When the high tone comes after a low tone, the low tone pulls the high tone down a little bit. Many linguists already understand how this works, assimilation, etc. I put all these rules down and got someone to put them into code. And it became what we call Yoruba text-to-speech, ttsyoruba.com, where now, if you go there, you can put any name, any Yoruba name or any Yoruba word, expressions. It struggles a little bit with phrases because it's what we call concatenated form, which is, it deals with them by syllables, so it's not always very smooth. But you can hear the correct pronunciation of a word if you put the tone marking correctly. And the tone marking is also very important, like I said earlier, because without it, the ambiguity in names can be problematic. So designing this then helped me to make sure the Yoruba name dictionary had a sound so people could pronounce anything they found there. So that was 2015, and since then we've been doing a number of other projects like that, again as a kind of personal intervention in this space where we assumed technology was speeding ahead and was leaving many African languages behind. I couldn't deal with every African language, but I had Yoruba, which I spoke competently, and I had people who were interested in helping to improve it. And then later that, 2015, I got a job at Google. They were looking for someone to lead a team to create the Nigerian English voice, like I've been mentioned. Nigerian English maps at the time, the maps in Nigeria at the time were, your options you had were American English or British English. And these were maps that couldn't pronounce Nigerian street names. So they needed they wanted to create a voice that would pronounce Nigerian street names in a Nigerian English accent. And then the project was eventually launched in 2019, which was when the article was written. Igbo names, this was launched just a few days ago, but we've been working on it for a long time. Again, the same process as Yoruba name. I had a couple of lexicographers who were working behind the scenes to make sure the names are correctly vetted before they come to the public. Those were all the projects we've been doing since 2025, again, because AI then came, because it started from technology, just the internet became a problem, and then language translation between one language and the other, problematic, and then now we have AI, which is, again, leaving many African languages behind. So these were some of the work that I've been doing. I saw an interview a few weeks ago. It was between President Zelensky and Lex Friedman, I think this one. And the two of them spoke English and Russian and Ukrainian. I think both of them had lived in many of these countries before, so they could speak those languages. But the interview I was seeing was totally in English. I watched the whole thing in English, in their own voices. And I didn't know when they were switching between language and the other. The only reason I knew that it was done in 3 languages was because at the introduction he explained that at some point in the interview they switched between languages. And the reason why I could watch it in English and somebody else can watch it in Russian the whole interview, or in Ukrainian, was because we have advanced to a point where computers can understand what has been said, use the data to translate when necessary to the language of the person listening, and then also synthesize their voices so that you can see the mouth move exactly as in the language you're hearing it, even though that's not the language they're speaking. Quite an impressive achievement. 2005, when I left university, this was not possible in any language at all. Unfortunately, it's still not possible in any African language today. You can't have an interview between two, about they are not speaking Yoruba and English, and have the person watching it see it only in English, without mouths moving in sync, or only in Yoruba, like this one where you can watch it in 3 languages. So these are some of the visions we've had, and the assumption that creating tools and especially data in many of these languages would help when people eventually come to create technological tools that can then benefit these languages. The reason why Ukrainian, Russian, and English were possible here is because those 3 languages are languages that have had years and years and years of data creation and people working in those spaces. You can have translation. If you go to Ukraine, you probably have translation of every classic novel you know in English. Probably already exists in Ukrainian. Somebody has done the work. There's probably a lot of Ukrainian speakers online using the language every day, so there's a lot of data to use. There's probably a lot of people speaking Russian and using Russian and writing Cyrillic, etc. online, and that exists. This doesn't exist in many African languages. Now, Africa has 2,000 languages. How do we even start to be able to get enough data to be able to create something like this in the future? These are questions I think about every day. And one of the conversations I had with Smarda earlier is about how do we even know what each community of language users want? What is useful for them in every instance? How do we know when we are doing more harm than good? And when we spend all the time doing machine translation or data gathering, etc., does each language need exactly the same thing? And how do we make sure that we can serve each language community and then use the effort we're doing to benefit both the language themselves and the global language community in general? It is possible, I assume. When I worked at Google, it took almost a year to complete the Nigerian English voice, like I said earlier. But today, 11 labs, you can just clone a voice in like 2 minutes. Record a sample of the voice, you can replicate it in different accents and different moods. Again, it's possible in English because English has extensive data all around the place. Everywhere you go, new words, expressions are being generated. So when people want to create stuff like that, they have something to use. African languages don't have that. So literature is one way in which I've thought about expanding this space and improving data and creating a corpus that can be usable in the future for a possible technological tool like this. And I've spoken in many places and advocated for Nigerian writers to, translate works into their languages or have others who do translation, speak to their publishers or encourage translation into African languages of their work. Many African writers today, from Soyinka to Adichie to Chimamanda, Adichie to Thiong'o, write in English, and we know them as English. They call them African writers, but they're really African writers in English. And many of their works exist in many translations, German, French, Ukrainian, etc., but not in their own languages at home. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is one notorious example where it's been published and translated into almost 100 languages. It doesn't exist in Igbo, which is a language from which the story was conceived. And so I've been, being an advocate of that. I've also been an advocate of people writing properly in the language when you find words and expression of many of these languages in the English text, which sometimes happens. You're writing a short story, the character says a word in the language, and you want to put that expression as it exists in that language in the text, while maybe sometimes you translate it later or not. you expect people to get it in context. Many African writers I've seen would write those expressions without the diacritics, without the orthography. And I've begun to notice it among many of my contemporary writers, and I called it out a number of times. Those were ways I thought would be ways to push back and help, create a record, a trace, eventually that can help people in the future who may want to do interesting things. There have been a lot of other efforts. Jalada Translation did a translation anthology where they took one short story by Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, translated it into about 100 languages in Africa. This was one effort that is happening. A number of other efforts happening like that. Masakane is another effort where it's a grassroots organization where scholars from all over the continent come together and do research in different aspects of language documentation. And hopefully our synergy would help the language grow in the future. This is my book, Ìgbà, my second translation. It's a collection of poetry by American professor Emily R. Grosholz, who teaches in Pennsylvania, who was looking for an African language to translate the book to, and I came and I did the translation. This is a collection of poetry. I've also done a number of short story translations, including Chimamanda, Adichie, Soyinka, Haruki Murakami. His the first African language into which a story was translated was mine. This book called Confessions of a Shinagawa Monkey. It's a short story. We did a multilingual anthology a couple of years ago as well, where we found short stories by Nigerian writers, found other Nigerian translators to translate them, and have other people read them out loud. And again, building a corpus, one language at a time, and hoping that this encourages other people to do so in their own ways. I'm currently the Africa editor of Best Literary Translations. These are translations of work from around the world into English that we select. So this doesn't quite fit into what I'm advocating particularly now, but the interesting thing about Best Literary Translations is that it also, at least I assume, help, if people know that the place exists for translations into English, encourage people to write poetry, creative work, short stories in their own languages first, and have other people translate them so they can get into spaces like this. Imagine my consternation a couple of weeks ago when I went online and found Chigozie Obioma, who is a Nigerian writer of fiction, spouting a couple of arguments about what he called assassins' ideology, assassins of African literature. That's what he said. He was making a big dig at the insistence of some of us that African writers write or tell their publishers to write African names properly when they write in their work. I'm going to show you some of those things he wrote, and I can tell you why I disagreed with it. So this is a tweet. I'm highlighting this part where he says, assassin ideology grows its branches out of a strange soil. Put a diacritic on your name and show that you're truly an African writer. Wear beads, speak about the ways in which you want to tell our stories, blah, blah, blah. He goes on and on. You've made a grievous mistake for a writer. Can, but does not have to define themselves, not by their work. This is true of some greatest writers today, blah, 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 blah. Of course, he mentioned Salman Rushdie, who, of course, we know him as an Indian writer, even though he writes in English. So let's give Obioma a benefit of the doubt for a little bit. And I told him on Twitter, he didn't respond to me, that he was writing nonsense. Because I believe that the reason why we insist that people write diacritics on words is not just because we think, oh, you're projecting identity or you're trying to show that you're better than others. It's for a different reason. He said, I hold the belief that the when and who are inferior artistic questions when you're writing novels, because they don't reach the soul. There's something superficial about them, he says. They engage our eyes, etc., etc. But the why is the most important question a writer has to ask, which is, why would a man be so driven by public view of himself as to be the one who murders his adopted son, like in Things Fall Apart? Or why would a man so want to inflict vengeance on a whale? He spends his entire life chasing it in Moby Dick, etc., etc. So far, so good, right? And then it says, for whom is a question that many African writers now ask, and that's a problem. He says, what the assassin ideology has done is to invent a new question, a new dangerous question that must govern a novel. For whom? He says it's an assassin ideology, the African writer needs to be authentically African. But what got me really upset with this part of it is that he refuses to see the bigger picture of why many people insist, many of us who happen to be writers and linguists as well, that people should pay attention into how they portray African writing and stick to orthographies and help us because they occupy an important space to help bring African writing and literature into the new, into the future. He says for whom is a problem because we're focusing on the wrong things. Rather than the story itself, we are looking outside. And the answer I came up with is the fact that for whom, that particular question, there are those for whom that for whom question has already been answered. And that is why many of them don't bother with these things, because it compares African writers to writers from around the world. But there are people who write from the United States, for instance, who don't have to worry about the language of the audience they are writing for, because they know they are likely in English. If they're writing in Spanish, the audience exists, or German or French. They already have in mind what type of mindset the reader has, what language they speak, etc. But for the African writer, it's not always the same. It's not always an easy question. There are some people, of course, for whom the question has been answered. Like I said, there are people who speak Yoruba, only Yoruba. They don't need to worry about. They're going to seek Yoruba scripture, they're going to seek Yoruba music, they're going to seek, just Yoruba input. Of course, they are dwindling in number, the same with many African language communities. But the reason why the conversation happened in the 1962 conference on Makerere was because the writers there were struggling with the transition between what they had known to be fundamental structure of their knowledge consumption and they were bringing, and the new world they were entering and ushering in at the same time. They had come from a community that taught them in their own native language. Soyinka said he didn't speak a word of English until he was 8 or thereabout when he went to school. Chinua Achebe also was raised in Ìgbà. And they were now in this community where they were now the forefathers of African writing and they had to write in English. So, of course, they were dealing with the questions of what is an African literature and should we write in our own language, and if we don't, what exactly are we losing?
Let's listen to an example. Head north on Ahmadu Bello Way towards Adeola Street and then turn right on Adeola Odeku Street.
Okay. Yeah, people seem to be very excited.
So let's listen to an example.
Okay. But there are, the Nigerian singers today like Ashake, who speak in Yoruba, who sing to Yoruba audience. They don't have to worry about what the audience of their work is. And there are people like Flavor who speak in Igbo and who sing in Igbo. Oxford University has Nigerian English voice, Nigerian English. They add Nigerian English words to their lexicon every year. And Nigeria English continues to be a valid course of study. We have Pidgin, we have Afrobeats, and those continue to exist. But there are many of us who still have native competence in the language, or who still care about how Yoruba language or any other African language survives in the world. And there are many people who are competent in both languages and are worried about what happens to their language in the end. And for them, they continue to seek an opportunity for those two languages they speak and in which they inhabit to continue to be valid and useful tools to be able to use everywhere on the internet. And that's why Obioma, I believe, is wrong. Because the for whom question has already been answered for so many people, but some of us, it still exists. Okay. I go back to Ronald Schaefer. Emai, the language he worked on for many years, is one of the most resourced, documented languages in Nigeria today. And that's the result of the work he's done over the years, coming to Nigeria every year. He and Professor Egohari. And it will continue to benefit the culture and the language and the people who use it over the years. There are some languages in Nigeria today which are bigger than Emai, but who don't have that advantage because they haven't had people like him go ahead and study and do work and document and speak with people and collect stories in those languages. One shouldn't be able to speak English alone to be able to access technology, I believe. I was speaking earlier about the accessibility function on our phones where a blind person can use a phone because there are ways you can do it without needing to see what is there. But accessibility options exist only in English. So there are people in Nigeria who don't speak English. So how do they use accessibility options, for instance? And there are people in many communities like that around the place. With data and research and a corpus that has been built over the years, if people decide that technology can help those people, then we have materials to be able to use. Thanks to people like Buhari and Schaefer, we have many of these. And so one day if MI becomes a language that's capable of working in technology, for instance, and it benefits the people in the area, people will be like, MI is a small language. There are bigger languages around it that don't have that same capability. Why? Because people have done the work, people have invested time and effort into creating data and collecting relevant stories that can be used. I submit that the assassins of literature, to use Obiama's expression, or of culture, of anything good, are the ones who insist that we must all think and behave alike and look and speak in just one way, in one language, believe in just one thing. In the end, it's not just in literature. They're probably the same people, who cause problems in, either in politics or in culture and in different other spaces. It doesn't always matter in what languages technology comes. It matters that technology is available for us to be able to use it in any language we want to, and be able to empower people. Because technology is just a blank canvas, it's just a tool. We can make it serve us by tailoring them to the languages you speak, so that we can use it. And Maya survived, like I said, because of this particular two men. One of them spoke German as a young boy in a country of overwhelming English speakers. The other one spoke Maya as a first language and now teaches, in a university and speaks English, and his children probably don't even speak a word of Maya. So there's an irony in that. And in the case of German, probably not, it's no longer a language spoken, a common home language in the US today, but it may not be a problem because a homeland exists across the ocean where a thriving literary artistic culture exists for German. But it may not be the same for many other languages like Zulu, like Ojibwe, Lakota, Yoruba, Fulani, Zulu, and the rest of them. What do we lose in the quest for homogeneity, in the fear of color, of difference, of, what's that abominable word again, diversity? So what my conversation with Schaefer illustrated to me is that in the end, something I've been worried about my own continents, the way English language and the fear of exploring different language options has damaged the growing of local languages, has come to America, which is such a sad thing. But what does this mean? What does the future hold? My work as a linguist is to make sure that every opportunity I have, I continue to do the work I do to make sure that Yoruba, for instance, is competent and can be used in technology, but not to lose too much of it enough on the assumption that technology will save the language itself. It's always the people that need to save the language, not technology itself. But this is a dictionary of MI, again published by Professor Buhari and Schaefer. Before I go, just want to illustrate some of the things I've spoken about with this particular tweet I found a couple of days ago, where Mr. Macaroni, a Nigerian entertainer and activist, was replying to someone in Yoruba without tone marking, in as angry as he could have put it, and someone asked Grok, which is an AI tool, to try to interpret it, and Grok tried his best as much as he could. I was quite impressed actually that I got much of it right, even though the word was not tone marked, until I got to this part where it says, "You may eat now, but wherever you eat, my creator will punish you," which was not what the man said. The man did say that my creator will punish you. Yes, he did say that, but what he said here was not only imaginisi was what he said, which meant that my prayers to you or my curses or whatever to you may not happen right now, but it will happen eventually. And the difference is the je, which is the difference between something being effective and something being eaten. Maybe there is a benefit in the fact that AI doesn't quite always understand everything we say. We can get away with a number of things. Or maybe not. So these are the conversations we will have eventually. I tried to adapt this famous quote, "No man is an island himself." No language is an island either. Every language is a piece of a continent, every part of a me. Any language that diminishes me because I'm involved, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls for you. Thank you very much.